I never thought pain could feel like this. Sharp, cold, like the edge of a glass shard pressed right into your heart. That night is a blur of muted sounds and bright, unbearable lights. The house felt too big, too empty, as though the walls themselves recoiled from the truth I had just uncovered. I remember standing in the doorway, my breath caught in my throat, staring at the message glowing on his phone. A name, a place, and a promise. That promise wasn't meant for me. He had handed it over to someone else. A woman who had what I couldn't give him, a child. The world tilted. I thought betrayal would feel like rage, but in those first seconds, it was silence that consumed me. Everything slowed down, my heartbeat, my thoughts. I just stood there, staring at the glowing betrayal in my hands, waiting for the numbness to pass. But it didn't. It sank in deeper. I tried to breathe, but my chest felt caged. The memories, once beautiful and comforting, now twisted like poison vines around my heart. I had seen this man as my future, my anchor. I let myself believe in us, in him. And now, I was sinking under the weight of it all. He came home minutes later, and I still don't know how I didn't shatter into pieces right then and there. When our eyes met, he knew. There was no need for words. He knew I had seen everything. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he said, voice low, almost apologetic. Almost, but not enough. I wanted to scream at him, to claw at his excuses, his pathetic attempt at regret. But I stayed still, like glass holding back a storm. I could feel my own restraint, brittle and sharp, holding me together. All I could manage was a whisper. "Why?" And that's when the dagger truly plunged deep. He didn't look away. He didn't crumble like I had silently prayed he would. Instead, he sighed, like this was a burden for him. She has my son," he confessed, as though that justified everything. As though it made everything else, our years together, my love, our dreams, suddenly irrelevant. My stomach twisted. I felt small, insignificant, a hollowed-out version of who I used to be. That was the moment when I realized that I wasn't just losing him. I was losing the person I thought I was when I was with him. He reached for my hand, and I took a step back, not because I was afraid of his touch, but because I didn't want him to feel my breaking point. I didn't want to give him that. He didn't deserve it. I felt the room closing in again, the weight of 1,000 unsaid words between us. Every memory flashed before my eyes. The late nights wrapped in blankets, the promises whispered under dim lights, the future we built in quiet conversations. And now? It was gone, stolen. The truth burned inside me, scorching away any illusion I still clung to. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't something we could fix. It was over. But as the tears threatened to spill, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was survival instinct. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe it was the quiet realization that this wasn't my final chapter. It was his. "Congratulations," I muttered bitterly, the only armor I could muster. "You've chosen her. You've chosen them." He tried to speak again, but I didn't need to hear his reasons. They were hollow, empty things that couldn't glue back the shattered pieces of my heart. So, I turned away. Not because I was weak, but because I didn't want to give him any more of me. As I walked away from him and into the darkness of the night, I felt the cold air wrap around me like a second skin. I was alone, but something in that solitude felt right. I didn't crumble like I thought I would. I didn't break. Instead, I whispered to myself, "This isn't where it ends." It's strange how memories can feel like soft whispers and bright fireworks all at once. When I think about how it all began, I don't remember the cracks or shadows. No, I remember the light, the way he made the world feel bigger, brighter. I remember him. We met on an ordinary day, but isn't that how fate works? It catches you when you least expect it. I was late for a meeting, running across the street with a coffee cup in hand, and in one of life's cruel tricks, I tripped. The cup slipped from my grasp, and before I knew it, the dark liquid was flying everywhere, mostly on him. He should have been angry. Most people would be. Instead, he laughed, a deep, warm sound that made my embarrassment sting a little less. He pulled out a handkerchief of all things, like some old-fashioned hero, and helped me clean the mess. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, something clicked. "Rough morning?" he asked, still smiling. I nodded, cheeks flushed. "You could say that." He offered to buy me a new coffee. "It's only fair," he insisted. I hesitated at first. After all, he was a stranger, but something about him made me say yes. And that yes was the first domino in a series of choices that led to, well, everything. One coffee turned into 2 hours of talking, then into exchanged numbers, and before I knew it, I was waiting for his messages like a teenager. When he asked me out on an official date, I didn't hesitate. We met at a cozy little restaurant with low lights and music that hummed gently in the background. I don't even remember what I ordered. All I could focus on was him. The way he leaned in when I spoke, how his eyes crinkled when he laughed, as if he'd rather be there with me than anywhere else in the world. The days that followed felt like something out of a storybook. Walks in the park that stretched long after the sun had set, lazy mornings wrapped in blankets and quiet conversations, late-night calls where we shared our dreams and fears in whispers. He became my safe place, my constant. The world outside could storm and rage, but with him, everything felt calm. He wasn't perfect, of course. He had a temper that flared occasionally, though never at me. He was stubborn in ways that could make me roll my eyes. But love has a way of smoothing over those edges. We both had flaws, but together, we felt whole. There was one memory that still plays in my mind like a scene from a movie, our first trip together. It was nothing extravagant, just a weekend in a quiet coastal town. We spent the days walking along the shore, collecting small shells and skipping stones. At night, we sat on the balcony of our tiny rental, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. It was there, under the vast night sky, that he first told me he loved me. I remember the way the words tumbled out, soft, unguarded. I didn't have to think about my response. I felt it so deeply that it was almost a part of me. "I love you too," I whispered, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. He made me believe in forever. We talked about the life we'd build, the places we'd visit, the home we'd share, the future that stretched endlessly before us. There were no doubts, no hesitations, just two people who found something rare and beautiful in each other. And yet, when I replay those moments now, there's a bittersweet edge to them. Because in the quiet corners of my memory, I wonder, were there signs? Subtle clues that hinted at how fragile our forever truly was? Or did I choose to ignore them, blinded by the warmth of love and the glow of possibilities? I didn't notice the first time he drifted off during one of our late-night talks, eyes flickering to his phone. I didn't question the sudden weekend trips for work that left me alone with a sense of unease I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was normal. Every couple has their moments of distance, right? But back then, all I saw was the love we had. He filled my world like sunlight streaming through a window, and I basked in it, unaware of the shadows creeping in. Looking back, I still can't pinpoint the exact moment everything began to change. Was it fate, or did I simply want too much? I don't know. All I know is that once upon a time, I loved him with everything I had, and for a while, I believed he loved me the same way. But love can be tricky. Sometimes it's the most beautiful lie we tell ourselves, and when you finally see the truth, it's already too late to turn back. The first crack wasn't something dramatic. It didn't come crashing into our lives like a sudden storm. It was more like the faint sound of splintering wood, soft, almost imperceptible. If you weren't listening closely, you'd miss it. And maybe I did miss it at first. Or maybe I ignored it, convinced that love was enough to hold everything together. It started with a simple plan, our anniversary dinner. I had spent the entire week thinking about it, imagining every detail. The quiet little restaurant we loved, the flowers I'd surprise him with, the bottle of his favorite wine. It was supposed to be one of those perfect moments that remind you why you chose each other in the first place. But that night, everything felt off. He was late, not just a few minutes, but nearly an hour. When he finally arrived, his tie was crooked, and there was a distracted look in his eyes, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. He kissed me on the cheek, absent-mindedly, as though it was a chore instead of a gesture of affection. I remember forcing a smile, telling myself that it wasn't a big deal. Maybe he'd had a stressful day. Maybe I was overthinking. But then he pulled out his phone during dinner, again and again. He wasn't even trying to hide it. Every time the screen lit up, his expression would change, something between guilt and annoyance. I tried to brush it off, but by the third time, I couldn't pretend anymore. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, casual. He looked up, surprised, like he hadn't realized I'd noticed. "Yeah, it's fine. Just work stuff." Work. That word had become his shield lately, an excuse to explain every late night, every canceled plan, every moment when he felt a million miles away, even when he was sitting right in front of me. And I hated myself for resenting it. I knew how important his career was to him. I'd always admired his drive, his ambition, but this felt different. "Can't it wait?" I asked, softer this time. "It's our anniversary." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Remorse, maybe. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. He nodded, put the phone away, and forced a smile. But the damage was done. The air between us felt heavier, like the conversation we weren't having was suffocating everything else. We made it through dinner, though neither of us ate much. I kept trying to reach him, to pull him back to me with small talk and shared memories. But it was like talking to a shadow of the man I knew. When the check came, he paid quickly and suggested we skip dessert. He was tired, he said. I smiled and agreed, but inside, something cracked. The car ride home was silent. I remember staring out the window, watching the city lights blur past, feeling that gnawing pit of dread in my stomach. When we reached our apartment, I hesitated at the door, keys in hand, feeling the weight of all the things I wanted to say, but couldn't. He walked in first, already loosening his tie, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. That night, as we lay in bed, our backs turned to each other, I stared at the ceiling, counting the seconds between his breaths. Sleep felt impossible. All I could hear was the quiet, growing distance between us. I told myself it was just a bad night. Every couple has them, right? But deep down, I knew this was something more. This wasn't just a bad night. It was the start of something I didn't want to admit. The man who once couldn't stop looking at me, who hung on my every word, was now slipping through my fingers. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to stop it. The following weeks were a blur of small disappointments, missed phone calls, plans rescheduled or forgotten entirely, moments that should have been ours stolen away by his sudden, urgent responsibilities. I found myself sitting alone at dinner more times than I could count, my plate growing cold as I waited for the door to open. And then there were the small lies, the harmless ones, the kind you tell to avoid an argument. "I'll be home in an hour." "I didn't see your message." "I was just with a colleague." I wanted so badly to believe him, so I did, until I couldn't. The first time I voiced my fear out loud, it felt like a betrayal to myself. I was sitting across from my best friend at a coffee shop, staring down at the untouched drink in front of me. The words felt heavy in my throat. "I don't think he loves me the same way anymore," I whispered. She reached across the table, her eyes filled with concern. "Have you talked to him about it?" I laughed bitterly. Every time I try, he slips away. It's like, he's there, but he's not really there. I don't know how to reach him anymore. She didn't have an answer. Neither did I. Looking back, I realized that this was the first real fracture. The night when love felt fragile instead of unbreakable. It wasn't one grand betrayal or some explosive fight. It was the slow unraveling of all the little threads that had once bound us together. And the scariest part was, I didn't know if I could pull them back, or if he even wanted me to. But the thing about cracks is that once they appear, they only grow. And no matter how much you try to pretend they're not there, they spread, until everything shatters. The truth doesn't arrive like a whisper. It crashes down like a wave, cold and unrelenting, stealing the breath from your lungs. I had been walking blindfolded on a path I thought was familiar, comforting, only to realize I'd stepped off the edge of a cliff. It happened on a Thursday, a day so ordinary that it felt almost cruel. I remember the morning light streaming through the window as I made coffee, humming softly to myself. He'd already left for an early meeting, kissing my cheek absent-mindedly before rushing out the door. But something about that morning felt wrong. His kiss was automatic, hollow. There was no warmth, no lingering softness. I tried to shake off the unease, to convince myself I was being paranoid. But that little voice inside, the one I'd silenced for so long, was screaming now. That afternoon, I decided to surprise him. It wasn't something I'd done in a while, and I thought maybe a small, thoughtful gesture would remind us both of what we had. I bought his favorite pastries from the little bakery near our apartment and headed to his office, imagining the smile that would light up his face when he saw me. But fate had a different plan. When I arrived, his assistant looked confused. "Oh, I thought he was working remotely today," she said, glancing at her computer screen. My heart sank. "Remotely?" I forced a smile. "Right, of course. I must have mixed up the days." I left before the tears could form. My mind raced as I walked back to the car. My heart was pounding so loudly that I could barely hear my own thoughts. Where was he? The question looped in my head, unraveling every assumption I'd clung to. I called him, my fingers trembling against the phone. No answer. Another call. Nothing. By the third attempt, my heart felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. I sat in my car, staring at the screen, waiting for a sign that I was overreacting. And then it came. The moment that shattered everything. A message lit up my phone screen. Not from him, but from a friend who had no idea what storm was brewing in my life. It was a simple photo she sent, one of those casual snapshots meant to make you smile. But this one didn't. It made my blood run cold. The photo showed a cozy little cafe downtown, the kind of place couples go to when they want to feel like the world belongs to just them. And there, in the corner of the frame, was him. He wasn't alone. She was there. The woman I didn't want to believe existed outside of my nightmares. She was sitting across from him, holding his hand, a soft, familiar smile on her face, the kind of smile you give to someone who holds your heart. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as the truth settled in, heavy and undeniable. He wasn't at work. He wasn't at some meeting. He was here, with her. For a few moments, I just sat there, staring at the picture, as though I could will it to change if I looked hard enough. But the more I stared, the more the details sharpened, the way he leaned in, the softness in his eyes, the way his fingers intertwined with hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally moved. My body felt disconnected from my mind, like I was watching myself from a distance. I drove to that cafe, every mile feeling like an eternity. A part of me still hoped I was wrong, that when I arrived, I'd see some logical explanation that would make all of this go away. But when I got there, the universe showed me no mercy. Through the large glass window, I saw them, closer than I imagined, their heads bent toward each other in quiet conversation. She laughed at something he said, and he smiled, the same smile that used to be mine. There was no denying it now. No more excuses. No more lies. The world blurred around me as I stepped forward, unsure of what I was going to do. My pulse was deafening, my legs weak beneath me. All I knew was that I couldn't stand outside any longer, watching my heart break through a glass pane. I opened the door, the soft chime above barely registering in my mind. His back was still turned to me. But when she saw me, when her smile froze and her eyes widened, I knew. She knew exactly who I was. He turned around slowly, as though he could feel the weight of my gaze pressing into his back. And when our eyes met, the last shred of hope inside me crumbled. He didn't look surprised. There was no panic, no confusion, just a quiet resignation, as though he'd known this day was coming. Why? The words slipped from my lips, broken and raw. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his face pale, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't name. Guilt? Regret? Or was it relief that the lie was finally over? She reached for his hand again, as though to anchor him. And in that moment, I realized something that cut deeper than the betrayal itself. He wasn't hers by accident. He chose her. He built a new life while I was still holding on to the ruins of the old one. I don't remember much of what I said after that. My emotions spilled out in tangled words, sharp and venomous, but somehow empty at the same time. He tried to explain, to offer some hollow excuse, but I didn't care anymore. The man sitting in front of me wasn't the man I'd loved. He was a stranger wearing his face. The cafe was silent, except for the sound of my heartbeat, loud and uneven in my ears. I walked away before he could finish his sentence. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't need to. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face like a slap, but I welcomed it. It cleared the fog in my mind. It was over. Finally, undeniably over. I had lost him long before that day. I see that now. But as I stood there, watching cars pass and life continue as if nothing had happened, I felt something stir inside me. It wasn't anger or grief. It was resolve. I had been broken, yes, but I wasn't destroyed. Not yet. The days that followed felt like a fever dream, a blur of pain, confusion, and desperate attempts to make sense of what had happened. I was caught between two conflicting instincts: to let everything burn, or to try to save what was left of us. It sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Trying to salvage anything after that. But love, even when shattered, has a cruel way of clinging to you, whispering that maybe, just maybe, it can still be saved. I didn't want to believe it was the end. I wasn't ready. So I did what broken hearts do. I fought. I fought for the pieces of what we used to be, even as they cut into me. I reached out to him first. A part of me hated that. I thought he should be the one begging, apologizing, doing anything to win me back. But the silence between us was unbearable. Days passed without a word from him after the confrontation at the cafe, and each hour of silence felt like a fresh betrayal. So I called him. He didn't answer the first time, or the second. On the third attempt, he finally picked up. His voice was quiet, tired. "Hey," he said, like nothing had happened, like we were still us. "Can we talk?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. A pause, too long to be comfortable. "Yeah," he finally replied. "We should." We agreed to meet at our apartment. My heart pounded the entire way there, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. When I arrived, he was already waiting, sitting on the couch, staring at nothing in particular. He looked worn down. I wondered if he felt any of the same agony that was consuming me. I closed the door behind me, but the room still felt cold and vast. We sat across from each other like strangers. I hated the distance, the emptiness between us. "I need to understand," I started, my voice cracking despite my best effort. "Why? When did it start?" He sighed, rubbing his hands over his face, as though trying to wipe away the truth. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered. "It just did." "That's not an answer," I shot back, my anger finally breaking through the sadness. "You don't accidentally end up holding someone else's hand in a cafe. You don't accidentally build a life with someone else." He flinched at that, but didn't deny it, and that hurt more than anything. The truth hung between us like smoke, thick and suffocating. "I thought we were happy," I whispered. "Weren't we happy?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I didn't want to admit. Pity, regret, but not the kind of regret that meant he wanted to come back. It was the regret of someone who was already gone. "We were," he said softly, "but things changed. I changed." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "You didn't even try to tell me," I said, my voice trembling. "You didn't give me a chance to fix things." "You shouldn't have to fix anything," he replied, his tone heavy with guilt. "That's the point. You did everything right. This is on me." Those words, the ones meant to absolve me, only made it worse. If it wasn't my fault, then what was I supposed to do? How do you fight for someone who's already made their choice? But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Is it her?" I asked quietly, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "Are you in love with her?" His silence was the answer I feared most. He didn't even try to lie. Tears welled up, but I fought to keep them from falling. "So that's it? After everything we've been through?" "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, and I almost laughed at how cliché it sounded. But there was no humor left in me. "You didn't just hurt me," I snapped. "You destroyed everything. Do you have any idea what it feels like to give someone your entire heart and watch them crush it?" He looked away, his jaw tightening. But I wasn't done. "I would have fought for you," I whispered. "Through anything. I would have chosen you over and over again. But you didn't even give me that choice." Silence swallowed the room again. I waited for him to say something, to tell me he'd made a mistake, that he wanted to fix this, that he still loved me. But the words never came. And that silence, it was the loudest truth of all. I didn't want to believe it. Even as the reality unfolded before me, I kept reaching out, trying to pull us back from the edge. Over the next few days, I suggested therapy, time apart, anything that might help us make sense of the mess. I sent messages I wasn't proud of, long, rambling confessions of my pain and my hope. Desperate words I wish I could take back. But his responses were always the same, short, distant, resigned. "It's too late," he said one night over the phone, his voice hollow. "We've both known it for a while." "We?" I repeated bitterly. "Don't speak for me. I didn't know. I never gave up." The line went quiet for a moment before he finally whispered, "I know, and I'm sorry." Sorry. That useless, awful word. It didn't fix anything. It didn't undo the sleepless nights, the ache in my chest, or the constant replaying of every moment that led us to this point. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was the realization that I couldn't make him stay. No matter how much I loved him, no matter how hard I fought, he was already gone. He wasn't mine to save, but I kept trying, even when I knew it was hopeless. Maybe I needed to. Maybe fighting for him was the only way I could say goodbye, to the future I thought we'd have, to the love I'd wrapped my whole identity around. In the end, it wasn't his absence that finally broke me. It was the emptiness left in his place. You can't fight for someone who's already chosen someone else. The conflict wasn't between us anymore. It was inside me. Between the part of me that still loved him and the part that knew I had to let him go. And letting go, that felt like the hardest battle of all. There comes a point when the pain stops defining you. Not because it disappears, it doesn't, but because you decide that it no longer controls you. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no grand cinematic moment where you suddenly feel whole again. No, it's small, almost imperceptible, a quiet shift deep within your soul. And for me, that moment came on an otherwise unremarkable morning. I woke up early, sunlight spilling across the floor. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, expecting the familiar heaviness in my chest, the one that usually greeted me like a cruel old friend. But it wasn't there, or at least, not in the same way. The grief felt distant, like a memory of an old wound rather than something fresh and bleeding. I went to the kitchen, made myself coffee, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was just going through the motions. I felt present, alive. It was strange and unsettling, but also comforting. I sipped my coffee and stared out the window at the city waking up. And in that quiet, simple moment, I made a choice. I was done waiting to be okay. I was done mourning someone who wasn't mourning me. The realization hit me like a breath of fresh air. I had been holding on to this idea that he was the center of my story, that everything before him, everything after him, revolved around the same axis. But that wasn't true. He was just one chapter, and I was the one holding the pen. I had been writing my life as though I was waiting for him to come back and finish the story, but I didn't need him for that. I could finish it myself. So I started small. I cleaned out the apartment, not just the physical remnants of him, but the emotional ones too. His old jacket? Gone. The mug he always used? Donated. The photos? Packed away, not out of bitterness, but because they didn't belong in my future. I needed a clean slate. The next step was harder, but necessary. I blocked his number and deleted our old conversations. I'd been holding on to them like artifacts of a lost life, scrolling through them late at night, hoping for some kind of clarity or closure. But those words only held me hostage. They kept me tethered to a version of myself that was desperate for answers I would never get. Letting them go felt like severing a chain I didn't realize I'd been dragging behind me. And then, something amazing happened. I began saying yes to life again. When a friend asked me to join her for a weekend trip to the mountains, I said yes. I didn't hesitate or make excuses about being too tired or too busy. I packed a bag and went, unsure of what I'd find, but determined to feel something new. The air was crisp and clean, the view breathtaking. We hiked for hours, laughing and catching our breath as we reached the summit. And when I stood there at the top, looking out at the endless expanse of trees and sky, I felt something powerful. Freedom. The kind of freedom that comes from shedding the weight you didn't realize was crushing you. That trip was a turning point. I remembered how much I loved being alive, not because of someone else, but for myself. I started making lists of things I wanted to do, goals I'd put on hold because I'd been so focused on us that I forgot about me. I signed up for a painting class, even though I'd never been good at art. I volunteered at an animal shelter, surrounded by wagging tails and wide, innocent eyes. I started running again, not to escape my thoughts, but to embrace the rhythm of my heartbeat, the strength in my legs. With every step forward, I felt a little more like myself, a new version of me. Not the woman who waited by the window or stared at her phone hoping for some miracle text. This version of me didn't care if he ever thought about me again. He had become irrelevant, a faded chapter in a much bigger story. The most surprising part? I didn't feel the need to explain myself to him, or to anyone else. I wasn't climbing out of the darkness to make a point, or to prove that I could be strong without him. I was doing it for me. And that realization was liberating. Of course, life being what it is, there was a moment when he tried to come back. It was a late evening, weeks after I'd started rebuilding myself. My phone buzzed with a number I no longer recognized, but would never forget. His name flashed across the screen like a ghost from the past. For a split second, I froze. Old instincts kicked in. My heart sped up, my mind raced. But then, a calm washed over me. I let the phone ring. I didn't need to hear his voice to know what he'd say. Maybe he'd apologize. Maybe he'd tell me he missed me, that he made a mistake. Or maybe he'd say something selfish, hoping I'd soothe whatever guilt he still carried. But none of it mattered anymore. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need anything from him. The phone stopped ringing, and I smiled. A small, quiet smile that felt like victory. Not over him, but over the version of myself who once would have answered in a heartbeat. That night, I stood by the window with a glass of wine, looking out at the city lights. I wasn't waiting for anyone. I wasn't searching for answers in the dark. I was simply content. The past was still there, a shadow in the corner of my mind, but it didn't scare me anymore. I had finally stepped out of the ruins and into something new. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The universe has a strange sense of humor. Just when you think you've closed a chapter for good, it finds a way to reopen it, but not in the way you expect. By the time I saw her, I was already at peace with the past. I didn't need closure anymore. I didn't need answers. I had moved forward, stitched up my wounds, and learned to walk confidently in my new life. But fate wasn't done with me yet. It was an ordinary afternoon. I had stopped by a cozy little cafe I'd discovered during my rebuilding phase. It was my haven, a place where I could read, write, and sip my coffee in peace. I had just settled into my usual seat when I noticed her. At first, I wasn't sure it was her. It had been months, and she looked different. Tired, worn. She was sitting at a corner table alone, staring blankly at her phone. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through messages, and I knew that look. I had worn that look. Our eyes met by accident, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Recognition flashed between us, followed by something else, something raw and unspoken. She hesitated before standing up, clutching her purse like it was her last anchor, and walked toward me. "Can I sit?" she asked softly, her voice hesitant. I could have said no. I could have walked away. But there was something in her eyes that made me nod. She pulled out the chair across from me, and for a moment, we just sat in awkward silence. I watched as she fidgeted with the strap of her bag, biting her lip as though she didn't know where to start. Finally, she exhaled a shaky breath. I think you know why I'm here." I folded my hands on the table and leaned in slightly, keeping my voice calm. "Do I?" Her eyes filled with unshed tears, and I felt a strange pang, not of jealousy, but of empathy. She wasn't the villain in my story. She was just another woman who had believed his lies. "I know who you are," she whispered. "I've known for a while now. He told me about you." I raised an eyebrow at that. "Did he now?" She laughed bitterly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Not the truth, obviously. He made it sound like you were some distant part of his life, a closed door, but I found out everything eventually." Her voice cracked as she continued. "And I found out I wasn't the only one either." That confession hung in the air between us like a bomb waiting to explode. I leaned back in my chair, processing her words. So, it wasn't just me. It wasn't just her. He was the problem, the common thread in all this destruction. "He's been seeing someone else," she admitted, her hands trembling now. "I found the messages, the same way you probably found mine." I felt a strange, calm detachment wash over me. I should have been furious on her behalf, or bitterly satisfied that karma had finally caught up with him. But instead, all I felt was tired. Tired of the endless cycle of his lies, of the way he left chaos in his wake. "Of course he has," I murmured, more to myself than to her. "He hasn't changed." Her eyes widened at my response, and I saw the realization hit her like a wave. She had spent so long believing she was special, different. But now she knew the truth. She had just been next in line for the same heartbreak I'd endured. Tears began to slide down her cheeks, and I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. She looked up, startled by the gesture. "I know it hurts," I said softly. "I know it feels like your whole world is crumbling. But listen to me. It's not your fault. It was never your fault." She nodded through her tears, but I could see the disbelief in her eyes. She wasn't ready to accept that yet, just like I hadn't been at first. But one day, she would. We sat there for a while longer, two strangers bound by the same wounds. She told me more about their relationship, how it had started with promises and stolen moments of bliss, only to unravel into secrecy and deceit. It was like listening to my own story told with a different cast. The same script, the same ending. "I thought he was my forever," she whispered, her voice hollow. "So did I replied, the weight of those words somehow lighter now. "But he wasn't. And that's not on us. It's on him." She wiped her eyes and smiled weakly. "You're stronger than me." I shook my head. "No, I'm just a little further down the path. You'll get there too." She exhaled slowly, as though releasing something she'd been holding on to for too long. "I don't know what to do next." "You take it one step at a time," I said. "You find yourself again, without him." We finished our coffee in silence after that. When she finally stood to leave, she paused, looking down at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not hating me." I smiled, a small but genuine one. "There's no point in hate. He's not worth it." She nodded and walked away, her figure disappearing into the street outside. I watched her go, feeling an odd sense of peace. She was at the start of a painful journey, but I knew she'd make it through. We all do, eventually. As I sat there, finishing my drink, I realized how far I'd come. There was a time when the thought of him, of her, would have destroyed me. But now? Now it was just another story. One I'd already survived. The real ending wasn't about him or the chaos he left behind. It was about me, choosing to rebuild, to rise, to thrive in a way he'd never expected. He was still trapped in his cycle of lies and betrayals, destined to repeat the same mistakes. But me? I was free. When I left the cafe that day, the air felt warmer, the sky brighter. I wasn't the woman I used to be, the one who had clung to the idea of love at all costs. I was someone new, someone stronger. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a survivor of heartbreak. I felt like the author of my own story. When you go through heartbreak, the world doesn't stop for you. People still laugh in cafes, the sun still rises every morning, and traffic still hums on the street below. In those first few weeks, it feels unfair. Like the world should recognize your pain, pause for a second, and acknowledge that something inside you has shattered. But the truth is, the world keeps spinning, and eventually, you start spinning with it. But something strange happens when you begin to heal. The world starts noticing you again. At first, it was subtle. Friends who had tiptoed around me for months began inviting me to things again, not out of pity, but because they could see that I was ready. I started saying yes to lunch plans, weekend outings, and spontaneous coffee runs. Slowly, the cocoon I had built around myself began to unravel. "You seem different," one of my closest friends said over brunch one day, her head tilted as she studied me. "In a good way." I smiled over my mimosa. "Different how?" She gestured vaguely with her fork. "I don't know. Lighter, happier, like you're back, but more you." I thought about that for a moment. She wasn't wrong. I did feel lighter, as though I'd set down a burden I'd been carrying for far too long. The woman sitting at that table wasn't just a return to who I used to be. She was someone stronger, someone who had faced the worst and come out the other side shining. People at work noticed it too. My boss, who had gently nudged me through projects when I was at my lowest, stopped asking if I needed extra time. Instead, he started praising my work again, my ideas, my confidence. "You're on fire lately," he said during one meeting, his tone full of approval. But it wasn't just the professional praise that hit differently. It was how I felt about myself. The timid version of me that had once second-guessed every move was gone. I spoke up in meetings, pitched bold ideas, and followed through. I wasn't working to prove anything to anyone. I was working because I wanted to succeed for myself. Even strangers seemed to notice something had shifted. One morning, as I stood in line at the same cafe where I'd once sat with her, the other woman, a barista I didn't know by name, smiled and said, "You've got good energy today." I laughed. "Is that a thing you can see?" He nodded, still grinning. "Totally. You're glowing." Glowing. A word I never thought I'd hear associated with me again after everything that happened. But maybe he was right. Healing had a way of showing up on the outside, even when you didn't realize it. The world around me was reacting to the version of me that had finally learned to choose herself. I started getting messages from friends who I hadn't spoken to in months, people who had given me space because they didn't know how to help. "We're so proud of you," one text read. "I knew you'd come back stronger." Another friend sent me a photo from one of our old trips, followed by, "We need to make new memories. Let's plan something soon." There was so much love around me that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't that it hadn't been there. It was that I had been too consumed by grief to feel it. Now, I felt it everywhere, in the laughter shared over late-night calls, in the hugs that lingered just a second longer, in the quiet support of friends who reminded me that I wasn't alone. And then, there was the unexpected. One evening, I ran into someone from my past, a mutual friend of his. I hadn't seen her since the breakup, and for a moment, I braced myself for pity or awkward small talk. But instead, she looked at me with wide eyes. "Wow," she said after a stunned pause. "You look amazing." "Thanks," I replied, amused by her surprise. "I mean it," she insisted. "After everything that happened, you're doing better than him." That caught me off guard. I hadn't asked about him. I didn't want to know. But there was a time when hearing his name would have sent a shockwave through me. Now? It barely registered. I raised an eyebrow. "I don't really care how he's doing." She blinked, clearly surprised. "Really?" I smiled, genuinely, not out of bitterness, but out of truth. "Really." She hesitated, then nodded. "Good. You deserve better." I left that conversation feeling proud, not because I had won or because he was struggling, but because I no longer needed comparisons to validate my progress. My healing wasn't about him anymore. It never really was. It was about the life I was building for myself. As the weeks passed, the world kept giving me small, beautiful reminders that I was moving in the right direction. A promotion at work, a spontaneous trip to the coast with friends, a lazy Sunday morning where I stayed in bed just because I could, without feeling the weight of emptiness pressing down on me. And then, something happened that truly made me pause. One morning, as I scrolled through my inbox, I saw a name I hadn't seen in a long time. His. It wasn't a long email, just a few sentences. "I've been thinking about you. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm sorry. I hope you're doing well." I stared at the words, waiting for the familiar wave of pain or anger to hit. But all I felt was nothing. His apology was too late, too hollow. I didn't need it anymore. I closed the email without replying. It wasn't out of spite. It was out of peace. I didn't need to explain myself or rehash the past. He was a page I had turned, and I wasn't interested in rereading it. The world around me had shifted because I had shifted. The people who loved me saw my strength before I even saw it myself. They reminded me that I wasn't defined by the love I lost, but by the love I still carried. For myself, for my dreams, for the life I was creating. And that life was beautiful. Not perfect, not without its hard days, but undeniably mine. The world hadn't changed. It had always been there, waiting for me to step back into it. And when I did, it welcomed me with open arms. Looking back, it's almost surreal how something that once felt like the end of the world became the beginning of something entirely new. There was a time when I couldn't see beyond the pain, when every thought began and ended with him. But life has a way of surprising you, especially when you stop clinging to the past and open yourself to the unknown. I didn't just survive the heartbreak. I rebuilt my life from the ground up, stronger and more beautiful than before. And the most important lesson I learned? I am whole on my own. I don't need anyone to complete me or validate my worth. The love I had been searching for in someone else? It was inside me all along. The future no longer feels like a blank void filled with uncertainty and fear. It feels like a canvas waiting for bold strokes of color, mine to create, mine to shape. One of the first things I did when I decided to move forward was set new goals, not for anyone else, but for me. They weren't grand or life-changing at first. Small, meaningful things that made me excited to wake up in the morning. I started journaling my dreams again, something I hadn't done in years. I took long walks in the park without my phone, letting myself breathe and feel the world around me. And then, step by step, those small dreams grew. I started taking classes in things I'd always been curious about, but never made time for. Painting, photography, even a language class that I'd always wanted to try. At first, I felt out of place, awkward, like I was trying on a new life that didn't quite fit yet. But then, something clicked. These new experiences weren't distractions. They were doorways into a version of myself I hadn't met before. A woman who didn't shrink herself to fit someone else's world, but who expanded into her own. The more I leaned into that growth, the more opportunities seemed to find me. One day, as I was flipping through my sketchbook after a painting class, a classmate complimented my work. "You've got an eye for storytelling," she said. "Have you ever thought about sharing this with more people?" Her words stayed with me. I had spent so much of my life quietly creating, writing, drawing, dreaming, without ever thinking it could be more than a hobby. But maybe it was time to take a leap. So I started sharing my work online, a small project just for myself. And to my surprise, people resonated with it. Comments poured in from strangers who saw themselves in my words, in my art. "You put into words what I couldn't say out loud," one message read. "You've inspired me to start again," wrote another. Their words filled me with a warmth I hadn't expected. I wasn't just healing, I was helping others heal too. And then came the big decision, the one that had been simmering in the back of my mind for months. A fresh start. I knew I wanted more than a symbolic reset. I wanted a physical one. I began looking for a new place to live. The apartment I had shared with him was filled with too many echoes of who I used to be. It had served its purpose, but it was time to let it go. I found a small but charming loft downtown, filled with sunlight and possibilities. Moving into that space felt like stepping into a new chapter. I decorated it with things that made me happy. Plants that thrived despite my lack of a green thumb, colorful artwork, cozy blankets. It became my sanctuary, a space that felt truly, wholly mine. The first night in my new home, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, watching the city lights shimmer below. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about everything I'd gained, freedom, strength, self-respect, and a quiet, unshakable sense of peace. The future isn't something I fear anymore. I'm not waiting for someone to fill the empty spaces in my life. I'm filling them myself. I've learned that love doesn't need to come wrapped in romance to be meaningful. There's love in laughter shared with friends, in the quiet joy of a morning spent in your own company, in the pride of pursuing a dream simply because it makes your soul come alive. I've also stopped measuring success by someone else's timeline. I don't need a perfect relationship, a milestone, or a trophy to prove I've made it. My life is already full because I've filled it with the things that matter to me. And maybe, just maybe, when you stop searching for someone to complete your story, you leave room for someone who simply wants to walk beside you for a while. One evening, during a rooftop gathering with friends, I found myself laughing so hard that tears streamed down my face. The sun had set, and the city lights twinkled like stars, and I had this sudden, overwhelming realization. This is what happiness feels like. Not the fleeting kind that depends on someone else's approval or presence, but the kind that grows from within. As the laughter quieted and the conversation shifted, a friend leaned over and asked, "So, what's next for you?" I smiled, the answer feeling lighter than it ever had before. "Whatever I want," I said. And I meant it. I don't know exactly where life will take me. There will be more challenges, more moments of uncertainty. But I'm no longer afraid of the unknown, because I've learned that no matter what happens, I have everything I need within me to rise, to rebuild, to thrive. I'm not defined by who hurt me or by the love I lost. I'm defined by how I chose to love myself in the aftermath. And that is a story worth telling. The woman I am now? She's not waiting for anyone to rescue her. She's already saved herself. And the future? It's wide open. And this time, it's mine.